Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So welcome to today's episode of How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. In the light of recent events, I've been reflecting deeply on how we as individuals and as a collective respond to the devastation caused by natural disasters. When we witness others experiencing profound loss and trauma, it can stir up a mix of emotions, empathy, helplessness, and even our own unresolved grief and trauma. As I process these thoughts, I'm inspired and reminded of the wisdom shared by my grief colleague Gina Moffa, who was a guest in the podcast on episode 48, and the heartfelt insights from my friend Tori Press, who I invited back to speak today, who also previously joined me in episode 39. Today, I want to begin by exploring some of these reflections on how we navigate witnessing such immense suffering. Then, I'm honored to speak to Tori, who's living just miles from where the wildfires have recently devastated an entire community. Together, we talk about what it's like to be so close to this kind of tragedy that happened in California, the emotional impact on both survivors and those supporting them, and what we can do to help. This is a conversation about loss, resilience, and the human capacity to hold space both for grief, our own and those of others. Let's dive in. I'm so glad you're turning in today. I've been thinking a lot lately about something that's really heavy on my heart, and I know it's been a lot of yours as well, especially for those of you in California, but really anyone who's been touched by wildfires or loss in relation to natural disasters in any case in their lives. So now, I don't live in Los Angeles, but Los Angeles is a place I love deeply, and I have so many friends there, and I spend some time in the city. It's a place that feels like home to me in some of the ways, and when I see what's been happening recently with the entire neighborhoods being torn apart by fire, it just breaks my heart. I'm also a native Australian, and if there's one thing I know well, it's the destructive force of nature, of bushfires, of water. So while I was living in Australia, I've firsthand been affected or seen how wildfires can devastate entire communities, homes, families, even whole towns, sometimes in just hours. It's something that stays with you. And so when I see what's happening in California, I can't help but feel a deep sense of connection and empathy for those affected, because I know just how overwhelming and tragic it has been for friends of mine, close friends of mine. So over the past week or so, I've been reading through stories and comments from people who've been affected by the fires. And honestly, I felt sort of a combination of sadness, disbelief, shock, and even some frustration at what I've seen in the way people are responding, both through tragedy itself, but also to the people who are suffering through it. You know, there's so much loss in that. And so much devastation. People have lost homes, livelihoods, and a whole community. They've lost history. They've lost possessions. And yes, while they might still be alive, losing possession is really about loss and followed by grief. It's going to be with them for a long time. But what I've noticed, and some of my colleagues in the grief space too, And what's been weighing on me is that some of the messages I've been seeing is that people sort of make light of it or focus on the good thing, but not really reaffirming the losses. So I'm sure you've heard them too. So for example, at least no one was seriously hurt, or at least you're safe and you can rebuild. And I get it, because these are cognitively true statements. It's absolutely true if someone hasn't lost their life, but just their house or their possession, at least they're alive. But it's emotionally barren. It doesn't actually reach the point of the devastation that people feel. And I know, look, people mean well, but I think we need to talk about why those type of bright-siding comments, that's what they're called, while well-intended, often they don't help and can actually make things worse. So if you've ever experienced a deep loss, whether it's natural disaster, the death of a loved one close to you, or anything that has shaken you to your core, chances are that you've heard some of the versions of the at least phrases. Maybe someone said to you, at least you still have your health, or at least you have good memories. In my case, with having twins and losing one, they said, at least you've got one and she's healthy. I know that when I lost my mom, people said things like, at least she had a good life, or at least you had a good connection and relationship with her. And honestly, those words, while meant to comfort, they didn't make me feel better. They made me feel like my grief was being minimized, like it wasn't okay to just feel the weight of my pain. And I know that's what can happen to so many people right now, especially those in California and those affected who have lost everything in the fires. This isn't just about property. It's about memories. It's about family history. It's about all that has made up your life. It's about what feels like a loss of identity and a loss of stability. And right now, what those people need most is space to grieve, to sit with the hurt, and to be supported without pressure to rush through their emotions or look for some kind of silver lining. It makes a huge difference if those people use those statements or if we use them for them. It's not the same. For them to look at the bright side is one thing. And maybe they also just saying it because people are saying it to them and they think they should at least look at the good side because other people might have lost some of their family members. Grief can't just be fixed by reminding someone of what they still have. Because when you're in the midst of trauma or deep loss, your nervous system is in survival mode. It's activated in what's called sympathetic. And in that state, people are not thinking about their future or the things they might still be able to rebuild. In that very moment, in that activation, it's about fight or flight. The brain and the body are just trying to survive. They're trying to get through the day, through the hour, the minute. And the last thing they need to hear is at least it wasn't worse. Because for them, they're experiencing the grief and the trauma of what they've experienced, and that is the worst that it got for them. So, and yet we hear this all the time. It's a form of bright-siding, which I've recently learned this term, I didn't know it, where we try to rush someone through their grief by pointing out the good amidst the bad. But bright-siding doesn't help. It doesn't heal. In fact, it often leaves people feeling isolated and unheard. It makes them feel like they have to somehow perform their grief in a way that fits into what is expected, into a neat little box, instead of allowing themselves to fully experience it. Now, the way people experience their grief following such kind of tragedy is individual. Each person reacts to it in a different way. So we can't compare in those instances. I also get that people don't know what to say when someone is in pain. I've been there. Even though I've been trained in grief and trauma, I find myself at a loss sometimes what to say. It's uncomfortable, and we all want to fix things and to make people feel better. But we have to remember that grief is not something to fix. It's something to sit with, to be present for. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of well-meaning comments like "at least," you know how much it stings. So, how can we show up for someone who's in the middle of devastation like this? How can we help, especially when they've lost so much? So here are a few ways we can truly be there for people who are grieving. First and foremost and most important is be present. Sometimes just being there is the most important thing you can do. Sending them a text message, saying, "How are you doing?" Or whether you're sitting with them in silence, offering a hug or checking in with them, it's the presence that means the world. It tells them they are not alone in their pain. Now, with being present, the second thing comes into mind, which is offer tangible support. You know, often people have said to me, "Let me know if I can be there for you. Let me know what I can do." People in those situations, they don't know what they need. And they usually don't ask for help. They're overwhelmed in itself. They're in survival mode, as I said. They're activated and sympathetic. Their nervous system is survive, run, fight, or flight. So offer something concrete. It could be bringing over a meal, helping them pack, offering them a bed for the night, place to stay. When someone's whole world has been turned upside down, it's those little things that can make the big difference. If you're unsure what they need, give them a list of 3 things. What can I do for you? Offer them 3 things that they can choose from. The third thing is validate their emotions. Simple words can be so powerful in these moments, like saying, "I can't imagine what you're going through," or "This must be so hard. I'm so sorry you're dealing with this," which is not implying that it is hard, but assuming that it is, because truthfully, we don't know unless we're in it, how it feels for us. But this allows the person to feel seen. And you, as a support person, you don't have to have all the answers. You do not have to find a silver lining. Just acknowledging the pain is a big thing. And in some moments it's enough, and it's all you can do. I know it can feel awkward at times. And I know it's hard to know what to say or do when someone is suffering so deeply. But remember, you don't have to fix it. Just show up. Sit with them in the mess. Hold space for their grief. So as we continue to witness the aftermath of these wildfires, just as an example of natural disasters, let's commit to showing up in a way that really helps. So instead of offering quick fixes or rushing people through their emotions, let's be present. Let's allow grief to be felt, to be honored, and without judgment. If you wonder why someone grieves that way and another person in a totally different way, just keep that wondering for yourself. It doesn't have to make sense. Let's create a space where people don't feel like they have to smile through their pain or focus on the bright side before they are ready. In the end, that's what healing is all about, being allowed to feel what you are feeling and being supported through it. Walking alongside someone within their pain, their grief, their trauma. So, as I mentioned, there have been a lot of thoughts on my mind in regards to the situation in California with the fires, just as an example of natural disaster. And I have the chance to speak with Tori, who I've spoken to before in relation to grief and loss. So go check out her previous episode, which I'll link in the show notes. But also, Tori is a good friend of mine, and we're co-hosting another podcast together. But in this episode, I really wanted to talk to you because of the vicinity of where it is that you live. So why don't you give a little bit of context so for people to listen, they can get an idea of what that means in terms of how close you are and how that has affected you.
Sure. Yeah. So I live in Los Angeles. I'm in the West Side. I'm near Santa Monica, and probably about 3 miles or maybe 5 kilometers as the crow flies away from the boundary of the Palisades fire, which, for additional context, my daughter goes to school or went to school about a quarter mile outside of that burn zone, and she had to evacuate from school on the day that the fire started. So while it's not, we're very fortunate. We're really pretty deep in the concrete jungle, not in a place where our home was threatened by fire. But a lot of our community, particularly the community at my daughter's school, it's an unfathomable number of people who have just lost absolutely everything. Um, yeah. And so you were asking me earlier when we were speaking about, how it kind of works and what the extent of the devastation is. And, this fire, it spared certain parts of the community. And it's weird. You can look at, there's aerial satellite maps, or there's a few videos of people who've sort of driven through these burned areas. And the area that burned is called Pacific Palisades. It's been there for, I don't know how long, a long time. Something like this has never happened to that community before. And so the fire, we had an event of Santa Ana winds. It's a pretty common wind pattern that we get here. But we had a particularly strong wind event where these winds were blowing hot, dry air east from the desert, west toward the ocean, which is the opposite of the direction they typically flow. And a fire started in the Santa Monica Mountains, and these hurricane force winds quickly blew the fire all across this entire community of the Palisades. And there's houses that were spared. There's little pockets, and you'll even see, it's very strange to see, but there's a street of burned out houses, and maybe one or two houses will have been spared. And sometimes it's because of the landscaping. People maybe didn't have brush close to the house. Maybe it's a newer home that was built with more eco-friendly materials and fire in mind. But by and large, even if you have, and I know many people who their house was spared, but their house is in the middle now of a neighborhood that's a toxic wasteland. And you have to think about, when a home burns, it's not like a wildfire or a forest fire, right? That's just all natural materials of wood. And I mean, that stuff's nasty to inhale anyway. But when a home burns, and particularly a community of homes and businesses that have been there for 100 years, you have asbestos, you have lead, you have plastic, you have metal, and everything that just burned up all within these homes. And that's what's in the ash, and that's what's in the smoke. And it's all over the ground. So the cleanup effort is just tremendous. They have to remove, I think, I'm not an expert, so just, but I've heard that it's about 6 inches of soil that they're having to take out to even begin rebuilding. And they've got to do that for thousands of structures that were lost. So even if you didn't lose your home and you're one of the fortunate ones whose home was spared, you're probably looking at smoke damage. You're looking at your house being in the middle of a toxic wasteland. They won't let you go there. You cannot go for at least 2-3 months, is what I've heard from people who are in the situation, that authorities have told them, you can come one time, collect whatever belongings you might want to. And then you're displaced just like anybody else who lost their home. You have to find a rental. You have to find another place to live in the meantime, because what's a home without a community?
Yeah.
What's a home without a neighborhood? And I'm speaking of the Palisades because that's the closest to me, but there's a whole other fire that took place near Pasadena, and it's the same thing. It's just an entire community of people that's been wiped off the map for all intents and purposes. And it's going to be many years before it can even come close to rebuilding to what it used to be.
Mm.
Um, and it's just thrown a lot of lives into turmoil, whether you were directly impacted or not. I think that the ripple effect outward from this disaster is just, I don't know anybody that I've talked to who isn't in some way touched by it or close to somebody who was. So,
Yeah. Yeah. As you just said, the ripple effect. I mean, you're relatively close. I mean, if I think about 5 kilometers, that's not even halfway from here to Zurich, from where I live. And we looked at the size of the fire that it affected the area, and we sort of put it on the map here for me to get an idea. It's the whole lake of Zurich. So I mean, that's a huge
mm-hmm.
place for it to have affected. Mm-hmm. And I mean, for me, I think so. When you talked about it, I also felt it in my solar plexus as a way to, okay, well, it's the whole community that is affected. So even though if the house might be spared, those people that are displaced, the sense of community, the sense of belonging, the sense of history that you have with each other, with your neighbors, with your school, with your church, with whatever in the vicinity, is completely shaken. And I think what I spoke about before in regards to bright siding or thinking about, well, at least we are still alive, which is a cognitive truth, but it doesn't take away the loss and the disruption of all these belongings and history and mementos. And so from your perspective, I mean, we spoke about it a little bit more. Your children are also affected because some of their school friends have lost houses. How does a community live with that? Because yes, you're still at home. Your home is there. How does that work?
I really think that it's an unprecedented situation, and these communities that are impacted really don't know what to do. And I can speak to that because I'm in group chats with parents from my daughter's middle school, which was very close to the burn zone. And some of the behavior and the way that these people are treating each other in the group chats is not really befitting of mature adults. There's been there's fear mongering, there's name calling, there's people who are getting angry with one another, like actual fighting kind of going on. And that's not to, call anybody out or say anything negative. It's, for me, when I read this stuff, it's really it's like pain. It's just looking at so many people's fear, uncertainty, pain, loss, grief. And it's just this whole community of people who are dealing with such a tremendous grief that they don't know how to hold it because it's too big to hold. And I think people are still really percolating on what happened. I think that, people have not really come to terms with the scale of the loss yet. And add to that there's many, many unknowns. We don't know a whole lot about these urban wildfires and what the after effects are. We don't really know exactly how bad the air quality is or how much we need to be afraid of ash and debris getting kicked back up in the wind as they're doing this removal process. People don't know if their children are safe at school or not. There's really nobody to tell them because it is unknown. And that, as a parent, I'm sure you can imagine exactly how mad with fear that would make you go. And for many people, they might live just outside the burn zone and their house is safe, but now they're living so close to this area that is, everybody's saying, look out for the toxic ash and debris, and they can't do anything about where they live. That's your home. And so everybody has different ways, some more skillful than others, with sort of coming to terms with this scale of loss. But I think the total unknown of the whole situation is just when you have a natural disaster like this that is truly unprecedented, there is no precedent and nobody can say anything reassuring. because nobody knows. And I think, to tie into the bright siding, it's like that's why people don't you don't want to hear, well, at least you're okay, because you don't actually know. I don't know. I don't know 3 miles away, 5 kilometers away. I don't know if I'm okay. I
Hmm.
was breathing in. I've been wearing an N95 mask, but there's plenty of information out there that say, well, N95 doesn't block these tiny particles of lead and asbestos. They're smaller than that, and it's just really tough
To not know, and to not know
to
what's going to, how that percolates
everybody's
into the future.
yeah, limbo, uncertainty, and all of these feelings. Hmm.
So when you were talking,
So to hear like, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, to hear that there's a bright side to it, you just feel like, what is it? Tell
yeah,
me.
the the way I'm listening is with the lens of polyvagal, of nervous system language, so to speak. And so when I think about the people affected, personally affected or closely affected, or in whatever way impacted, is that a whole region is dysregulated in their nervous system. And at the beginning, when a terrific situation like that occurs, people go first into sympathetic. So they go into fight or flight, right? I mean, literally, people have
Hmm.
to flee their homes with some
Yes.
preparation or not. I've heard how they prepare for that. But some, you don't know, can you stay, can you not? And then you leave. So it's fight or flight. It's simple as that.
Hmm.
And then after some time, when the nervous system cannot regulate itself, then that gets into an overwhelm. It can't hold up that kind of energy for forever. Then it might go into dorsal shutdown, sort of a depressed state, or completely run on adrenaline and stay in this some kind of dysregulation. So usually a nervous system like that, I find when people have experienced trauma or significant loss. So in the aftermath of that, and this is a trauma, there is a chronically dysregulated state. And now in this
Hmm.
situation specifically, as you were saying, there's no precedent as well, because it's not just a person or people that I work with might have experienced a trauma in their home or something specific to them, whereas the community around them is there to co-regulate. Their nervous system might be still normally regulated, completely dysregulated. So in this situation, a whole, I don't want to say nation, but a whole state or region is in this dysregulated state. And so when you were talking about the conversation that you watch in the groups of the chats that you mentioned, it is to no surprise to me that these nervous systems are still under so much stress, and whichever
Hmm.
state they're in, when you say fighting or name calling or completely desperate in their sense, it makes sense as to the nervous systems of so many people at the same time. It's like a war zone, right? There's no war,
Hmm.
but there was a
Absolutely.
natural disaster.
Hmm.
So how do kids deal with that, your daughters?
Well, the children are actually remarkably resilient, which I guess is sort of what everybody says. Oh, kids are resilient, but watching them, it's like I think they don't have quite the same like scope and ability to think long term about what the disaster really means, in the same way that adults do. And I know children, friends of my kids who have lost their homes, and they're just like, okay, well, they just pivot, and they're and I must say, like the families that we know, fortunately, have means to go and find a rental. I don't think anybody is, while there might be a long term, I mean, you lose your home, there's insurance questions and finance, but I think we don't really know anybody personally who is deeply struggling because of this loss, to like find another place to live, or who can't afford a hotel. I have friends of friends that are in that situation, and we've just donated to their GoFundMe. There's lots of relief efforts. The school communities are raising money to donate to families impacted, and I mean, actually, I would say like that perhaps it is, that part of the fight or flight nervous system response, like those of us who have neither had to fight nor flee, but are still feeling this response. There's been this massive impulse to help out. And so, you had in the first week following the fire, people were donating so many goods they set it up at the Rose Bowl, and then they had to move it from the Rose Bowl, which is an iconic American football stadium. And they moved it to a racetrack. And then they had to say, please stop bringing donations. We have too much. The footage on the news is of a giant outdoor flea market where people can just come and pick up what they need. Similar relief efforts for the firefighters and frontline workers. So, people are channeling this energy into wanting to help and do good and, help out their neighbors. But at what point does that end? There's a big outpouring of support while everybody is dealing with the immediacy of these feelings. But, humans aren't wired, as you say. You can't persist in that way of being for, indefinitely. You burn yourself out. And so, I think the real question is going to be what happens in a few weeks or months from now, and where we're seeing these kids showing resiliency and, a remarkable ability to cope or to pivot to Zoom school, as is the case with a high school that partially burned and they can't return there for the foreseeable future. I have many of my friends' kids go to this high school and they seem fine. They've pivoted to Zoom school. They're handling it. But I think it's the type of thing where you maybe don't see these effects right away. I think it's something that they're going to carry with them, and they're going to have trauma and these feelings to deal with the next time something comes up in their lives. Or, I don't think that. And I talked to my own therapist. I was like, I don't think I'm really dealing with this right now. Like, I don't think I can. I just don't think I can process it right now. And I'm a middle-aged grown-up lady. I can't imagine being a child without as much life context. So, yeah, they seem okay on the outside, but are they?
Yeah. Well, it sounds to me like the long-term effect that we see now from the COVID pandemic on the kids in terms of not going to school or the gaps that they have. We can see it now 4 or 5 years later. And as you say, no precedent. So we will see what this does in the future, or what is left over. And I think in terms of understanding what it does to the person, I take the parallel as to someone grieving a significant loss, where in the raw phase, they have to deal with everything like the funeral, creating space, maybe emptying a house. So they are on adrenaline and they're doing all these things. And then there comes a time when the immediate things that need to be done are done. And then it's the question of, well, what then? And as you were saying, and what I've seen happening in Australia when the bushfires happen or floods and big disasters happen, is after some time people move on, especially people around, and it sort of gets forgotten. I mean, the thing is, if bush burns down, you can see the regrowth after quite some time. You see it naturally happening. It takes time, but it's obvious. But in terms of the people, you don't see that regrowth because it's inside. So you can't really see how is it going. Is this nature, this person, is it rebuilding, regrowing, readjusting? And I remember one of my friends in Australia, they lost their home in the Canberra fires 20 years ago. And she's still talking about it and was dealing with PTSD dealing with that. It's not something that just is resolved and you move on. So it's to be expected that this will continue and be a part of people's history for quite some time. I don't want to put a number there or an expectation, but it's something that is not just a quick fix.
Right. No.
And I think in terms of the title of the podcast, How to Deal with Grief and Trauma, this is actually, in this moment, is a little bit too early to ask, well, how do people deal with it? As you were saying, at the moment, it's the the short-term actions that people are taking, we can have a look at that, just like with the pandemic. I said 5 years later, and we can reflect back and say, well, what happened with the whole community? How did the community heal? Because yes, it's all an individual basis, but then it's a community that needs to heal, including all the elements that are unseen that form the strength of a community. What do you wish people who are maybe not as close as you are, what would you wish they would know or understand?
Well, I mean, this is a very, I don't want to get political or talk about, that perspective, but I do think that in the case of any kind of a massive tragedy of this sort, there's always voices that come out and say, well, here's what you should have done, here's what you could have done. And, they like to, a lot of armchair experts sort of come out of the woodwork and try to tell you how to deal with it or what you did wrong. And I guess, for anybody who's listening to any voices like that, because anybody who has an agenda to push will always come out and try and push it for their own personal gain. I would just say, think about it's just the age old advice of put yourself in these people's shoes and how you would feel. I just have a real problem with people who would seek to politicize a disaster of this kind, at least in the immediate aftermath. I think that certainly there's always questions to be asked and answered about why this happened and how we can prevent it from happening in the future. But coming up with blame and finger pointing in the immediate aftermath, I don't think serves a purpose other than to really re-traumatize the people who are actively dealing with the fallout of that disaster. I think one thing that is very hard to understand if you don't live here is how something like this can happen. Because if you're living in if you're not living in this type of a climate that, wildfires are part of the landscape in Southern California. They are part of the ecological cycle. Like everything here evolved to burn, and it happens. Like it's actually a natural part of our ecosystems. And I think that a lot of people, don't really understand that. I think people are sort of, if you don't live in that type of ecosystem, you think of fire as being something that's preventable, and you learn how to do fire prevention and don't leave burning candles unattended and blah, blah, blah. And I think it's just really hard to understand exactly how quickly and how unpreventably something like this can happen and how quickly it spread. So, while I think it's really important to answer questions and try and rebuild houses in a more fireproof way and implement systems and structures that will protect people more in the future, I would just say, try to understand that nobody could have predicted this and nobody could have stopped it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It was just, it's, imagine stopping fire spreading when you have 80-mile-an-hour hurricane force winds blowing embers around. And there's no shortage of videos on YouTube if you want to see what it actually looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you gave a good explanation on that in the beginning. And I'm also used to that understanding in terms of the Australian bush that is made to use fire for evolution in the sense. But yes, we have the houses close to the bush, and then it's a question of where do we make sure that the houses are not part of that rebuilding of nature. Well, thank you. I think we will continue this conversation, but I think it's good to give people who might not be able to put themselves in your shoes or in people's shoes that have been affected, just a little bit of a glimpse of an insight into how this is affecting this whole community. Thank you, Tori.
Oh, just one person's. I think you're welcome. Just one perspective out of very many. So, yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening today. If this episode has resonated with you, I encourage you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're someone who's been affected by this tragedy or by any kind of loss or trauma, please remember you don't have to go through it alone. Reach out. We're in all of this together. Take care and remember to be gentle with yourself and others. Grief doesn't have a timeline, and neither does healing. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.